The streets of Britain shook today with a force that cannot be ignored. On September 13th, thousands of people poured into the heart of the UK in one of the most dramatic and emotionally charged protests this country has seen in years. Voices rose as banners filled the air, chants echoed through the streets, and a message was delivered loud and clear. The people are fed up. They want answers, they want change, and they are no longer willing to stay silent. What unfolded today was not just a protest, it was a warning, and at the center of it stood a figure who has long been at the heart of controversy and debate: Tommy Robinson. His words, his presence, and his message sent shockwaves across the nation, leaving the government scrambling and the media in a frenzy. Today's protest was not simply about one man or one movement. It was about anger that has been boiling for years, resentment that has been ignored, and frustration that has finally erupted onto the streets. People from across the country traveled to make their voices heard. Mothers, fathers, young men, and elderly citizens, ordinary people who feel the government has failed them, stood shoulder to shoulder, united under one cause. They came holding flags, placards, and banners that called out what they believed to be the failures of the current system. For many, this was not just a protest, but their last resort, their way of demanding that those in power finally listen. As the cameras rolled, Tommy Robinson addressed the crowds with words that have already been described as a final warning to the UK government. His tone was fiery, his delivery emotional, and his message sharp. He spoke of what he described as years of betrayal, a system that puts the interests of politicians above the will of the people, and a growing disconnection between the government and those it is meant to serve. Robinson declared that today was not about violence, not about hate, but about truth, justice, and the people's right to be heard. And while his critics will argue against his words, there is no denying the scale and passion of the movement that gathered behind him today. The chants of the protesters grew louder as his speech continued, creating an atmosphere so electric that even those watching from home could feel the weight of the moment. Some described it as a turning point, a day when the frustrations of millions were no longer whispered in pubs or behind closed doors, but shouted at the very heart of power. The government, meanwhile, was quick to respond. Officials called for calm, urging people not to let emotions spiral into unrest. Some dismissed the protest as the actions of a vocal minority, while others admitted in hushed tones that this was a warning they could not afford to ignore. The mainstream media, too, was split. Some outlets described the protests as chaotic and dangerous, while others acknowledged the genuine pain and anger driving people into the streets. But perhaps the most striking part of today was not the speeches or the slogans, it was the faces in the crowd. These were not professional activists or career politicians. These were ordinary citizens, plumbers, shopkeepers, builders, teachers, and parents. Their faces carried the weight of disappointment, the exhaustion of being ignored, and the determination of people who have nothing left to lose. They came not because they were told to, but because they felt they had to. For them, this protest was not just about today. It was about the future of their children, their communities, and their country. Tommy Robinson's final warning to the government was delivered with words that will echo far beyond this day. He said, "You have ignored us for too long. You have silenced us, mocked us, and betrayed us. But today, we are here to tell you this ends now. We are the people, and we will not be pushed aside any longer." It was a speech that drew roaring applause from his supporters and immediate criticism from his detractors. But whether you agree with him or not, one thing cannot be denied. His words have left an imprint on British politics that will not fade easily. This is no longer about one protest or one speech. This is about a country that feels deeply divided, a population that is losing faith in those elected to lead them, and a political class that seems increasingly out of touch with the realities on the ground. Today's events were dramatic, emotional, and powerful, but above all, they were a reflection of something much deeper, an ongoing struggle between the governed and those who govern. And as the sun set on the protests of September 13th, one thing was clear: this was not the end. This was only the beginning. The people have made their warning known. The question now is, will the government listen, or will they ignore it until it is too late? This moment will be remembered as one of the most defining political flashpoints of our time. And whatever comes next, Britain will never be the same again. In the hours following the protest, Britain's political landscape seemed to shift in real time. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, pundits debated late into the night, and social media platforms lit up with videos, pictures, and heated discussions. Clips of Tommy Robinson's speech spread like wildfire, reaching millions of people within hours. Supporters hailed it as a voice of truth, while opponents condemned it as dangerous rhetoric. But whichever side people fell on, there was no denying that the country was paying attention. Parliament itself was shaken by the events of September 13th. Senior figures within both the ruling party and the opposition were forced to confront a question they had tried to avoid for years. What happens when the people lose faith in the political system? For some MPs, today was a wake-up call. They warned that ignoring the protest would only deepen the divide, while others dismissed it as an overblown spectacle. Yet behind closed doors, panic was brewing. The government knows that protests on this scale don't just disappear. They grow, they spread, and they shape the national conversation in ways that politicians cannot control. For Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, the timing of this demonstration could not have been worse. Already battling criticism over policies, internal disputes, and questions about leadership, the protest threw fresh fuel onto the fire. Starmer's critics seized on the moment, claiming it showed how disconnected Labour had become from the very people they were meant to represent. Across the aisle, Conservatives were no less uneasy. They too have faced growing resentment over immigration, economic struggles, and what many describe as broken promises. Neither major party walked away unscathed from today's events. And then there was the voice of the people, the ordinary citizens who have long felt silenced. For them, September 13th was not about left versus right. It was not about one party against another. It was about being seen, being heard, and demanding accountability from those who sit in Westminster. Many who attended the protest spoke about rising costs, failing public services, and the sense that their communities have been abandoned. They described the protest as their last resort, a cry for help that had been ignored for far too long. Tommy Robinson's role in this cannot be overstated. For years, he has been a lightning rod in British politics, admired by some, despised by others. But today, his words carried a weight that transcended his usual supporters. His speech was not just an attack on the government, but a challenge to the entire political establishment. He framed it as a struggle between the people and those in power, and he positioned himself as the voice willing to say what others would not. His critics argue that his message risks deepening divisions and fueling unrest. They warn that his rhetoric could push vulnerable people into anger and confrontation. But his supporters see something very different. They see a man speaking the words they've longed to hear, expressing the frustrations they've bottled up for years, and standing where mainstream politicians have refused to stand. This contrast between condemnation and admiration is exactly why his final warning speech has left such a lasting impact. As the debate rages on, the government faces a critical choice. Do they dismiss this protest as noise, hoping it fades away, or do they recognize it as a symptom of something far greater? If they choose the first path, they risk pushing more people into the arms of movements outside the traditional political structure. If they choose the second, they will have to confront uncomfortable truths about how Britain is governed, who benefits, and who is left behind. In the aftermath, commentators began drawing comparisons to historic moments of unrest in British politics. From the poll tax riots of the 1990s to the anti-war protests of the 2000s, history has shown that when ordinary people gather in mass numbers, governments cannot simply pretend it didn't happen. September 13th may well go down in the books as another such turning point, a day when a frustrated population decided they would no longer be ignored. The ripple effects are already being felt. Opposition groups are planning further demonstrations, politicians are being forced to address questions they had hoped to avoid, and trust in institutions like the police and the press is being tested in new ways. Meanwhile, the international press has begun to take notice, with headlines across Europe and beyond asking whether Britain is on the brink of a political reckoning. The emotional intensity of today's events cannot be overstated. For many protesters, attending was not just a political act, it was personal. It was about protecting their families, safeguarding their communities, and fighting for a future they feel is slipping away. That level of passion is not easily dismissed, and it is why this moment will continue to haunt the government in the weeks and months ahead. What lies ahead for Britain is uncertain. Will these protests grow into a larger movement that forces genuine political change, or will they fade into history as just another demonstration that failed to break through the walls of power? That depends not only on the protesters themselves, but on how the government chooses to respond. One thing, however, is beyond doubt. September 13th has changed the political conversation. It has brought long-simmering frustrations to the surface and reminded those in power that the people are watching, the people are speaking, and the people will not be ignored forever. And as Tommy Robinson's words echo across the nation, the final warning still hangs in the air. Will the government listen? Or will this day be remembered as the spark that ignited something much bigger than they could ever control?